What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. We'll be going over every backfield today, talking about which running backs to start and sit. But before we do that, have to start things off with the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was among the top 10 wide receivers in points per game. Just one has fewer than 5 receiving touchdowns. Who is it? And the answer is Stephon Diggs. And Coach Dan was the first to get that one right. Today's stat: who led the league in air yards last week? All right, so we actually have a Thursday night game this week after not having one last week, and it's the Patriots at the Rams. This game has a pretty low 44.5 point total, and the Rams opened as 6-point home favorites, but so far that's been bet down to only 5-point home favorites. For the Patriots, it is the same as always. Harris will get some work, Sony will get some work, James White will get some work, and then Cam will steal basically all of their touchdowns. Harris is the only one that you're really going to want, but as a road underdog against a good defense and a low total game, I would probably look elsewhere unless you're in a standard scoring league, then he's much better. But in half and full PPR, it's a little bit thin, especially for the first week of the fantasy playoffs. If you want to use James White in a full PPR league, then you would do that assuming the Patriots are trailing. Like, the Patriots win this game handily. They're ahead for most of the game. It's probably not James White being the one you want. But if you think Vegas is correct, that the Rams will be leading, and maybe you think that the Patriots will be forced to throw, James White will be a little bit better. But again, only in a full PPR league for him. And even then, he only has 4 receptions over the last 2 weeks. He's been over 40 receiving yards twice all season, so it's a pretty thin play. For the Rams, as we went over last week, Akers may have possibly taken over the backfield, but I say possibly because it's the Rams. They've done this before, and they've gone right back to a committee. Assuming everyone is healthy for this game, a few guys are a little banged up, but assuming all 3, Henderson, Brown, and Akers, are out there, I would still have a hard time starting any of them this week. Cam would be the one that you want because his production recently has been there, and I do not think that you are playing Henderson or Brown. Maybe Akers misses or maybe Henderson misses. Like, there's different scenarios that could happen here, so just check the rankings. You guys, the rankings will be posted when this video goes out. They're not posted for me right now because I do that right when I finish this video. But they'll be posted when this video is out, so you can take a look at that and then take a look if any news comes out on Thursday, because remember, this game is on Thursday, and see how the rankings get adjusted for these 3. But again, if all 3 are out there, then I would prefer not to play any of them, but Akers would be the one that I would trust the most, and it still would not be trusting very much. And remember, everyone has access to these rankings. So the rest of the 2020 season, all of the rankings, the sports betting, the DFS info, everything is free, so you can check that out, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. So, Texans at Browns is the next game we will go over. This game is another low total, another 44.5 point total, and the Texans are currently 1-point road favorites. For the Texans, David Johnson returned last week against the Colts, and we saw him take back his lead in the backfield, getting 10 carries, then only 2 targets compared to 2 carries and 6 targets for Duke. Honestly, this backfield is pretty much a stay away for me this week. The Johnsons are going to split the workload. It's not going to be a split in carries and targets, but if we look at the totals, so it's not that Duke and David are both going to get 8 carries and 4 targets. It's that David's probably going to get most of the carries, a few targets, and then Duke comes in there for like a few carries and the rest of the targets, and they just steal each other's workload. So I would prefer not to play them in most matchups. But then you look at the matchup and it's like, oh, they play in Chicago. Okay, we can just cross them off the list. David is the one that you would prefer because he has more touchdown equity, but you're going to need a touchdown for one of these 2 to pay off, and that's a pretty difficult spot this week again in Chicago. So I would say they're both avoids. On the Bears side, Dave Montgomery is the running back 1 overall in all of fantasy over the last 2 weeks. He's a running back 7 since Cohen went down, and he's a running back 1 yet again against a Texans defense that's allowed the 2nd most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Patterson is like a viable play if you're desperate in like a 16-team league, but other than that, I know the carries were kind of there last week. If you're in a 10, you're in a 12-team league, you're not starting Cordero Patterson this week. Next up, we've got the Vikings at the Bucks. This game has a 51.5 point total, and the Bucks are 6.5 point home favorites coming off their bye as well, so I would expect them to play well in this one. For the Vikings, always play Dalvin Cook. This is one of the most difficult possible matchups, especially, again, going to Tampa Bay, and they're coming off of their bye. They were already a top 3 run defense. It doesn't matter. You always play Dalvin Cook. For the Bucks, it's really tough to know. Like, Ronald Jones looks like the better running back, but Fournette has been out snapping him lately. But then even with the lead in snaps, like, I can't justify playing Leonard Fournette. You know, it's not that the matchup is terrible, but he hasn't gone over 30 total yards since week 9, you know, and it's worth noting that in that week that he went over 30 total yards, he had 1 carry for 0 rushing yards. Like, you just can't play Leonard Fournette right now. And then Ronald Jones is also pretty tough to trust because he's getting 35% of the snaps recently, but he does have the upside to reward you if you take that risk. You know, he is a touchdown home favorite. He does have 4 games on the season where he has over 100 rushing yards, and if they were to get up, you'd think he'd be the one to have these carries. The touchdowns will be random. It's whoever they feel like putting on the field. But for the yardage, who they're giving the workload to, assuming he doesn't fumble and assuming they're winning by a touchdown, which is what the Vegas is projecting, you'd think Ronald Jones would have a good game. I'm viewing him as a running back too because of that, but one that has an extremely wide range of outcomes. Like, he could score 2 points, he could score 25 points. Not many running backs have that ceiling this week. It's a pretty bad week for running back, so playing someone who has that ceiling of 25 points might be a smart idea. But you've got to realize that he could score you 2 points, and that could lose you the playoffs, so you got to take that into account. I would like to note that I am playing him this week, and so my guess is that he will land much closer to the 25-point range than the 2-point range. Next up, we have Titans at Jaguars. This game has a very high 53-point total, and the Titans are 7-point road favorites. For the Titans, this is a smash spot for Derrick Henry. Bad run defense. The Jaguars aren't trying to win. Touchdown favorites. Like, this is a spot where you expect him to have 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. That's obviously an exaggeration, but this is a spot where he could do that. You're obviously playing him. For the Jaguars, again, they're tanking, so we can only trust one player, but that player plays running back. So James Robinson should be played in all lineups. He has proven to be a matchup-proof running back 1. And you know what? This is not a bad spot. The Titans don't have an incredible defense. The Jaguars are home. Could they find at some point in this game that they're winning like 17-14? Sure. I don't think they're going to win the game, but at some point they could be winning. They could be leaning on the ground game. He has a lot of touchdown equity. You're playing James Robinson. Next up, we have a very exciting game between the Cowboys and the Bengals. This one has an exciting 43.5 point total, and the Cowboys are 3.5 point road favorites. For Dallas, assuming it's not a blowout, Zeke should see his usual 20 touches, and you know what? The Cowboys aren't blowing teams out, and neither are the Bengals, so we should see Zeke around 20 touches. Most of those will come on the ground, but he'll get a few through the air. He's going to be less efficient than he was with Dak. He's going to score fewer touchdowns than he would have with Dak. But they're not going to be favorites very often, and the Bengals don't have a very good run defense. They're 21st in rush defense DVOA, 29th in yards per carry allowed. So if you got Zeke, you're starting him this week, and I wouldn't be playing Pollard. He's still just a high upside handcuff, not getting enough touches to be started. For the Bengals, Mixon is eligible to return this week off the IR. I do not know if he will, but I have a hard time believing they're going to rush him back. So unless he's 100%, they're not bringing him back in, and it was a pretty bad injury, so I don't think he'll be 100%. Again, I'm not a doctor. You should just pay attention and see if they activate him, see if he's healthy. But I would be surprised if Mixon played this week. So I'm going to assume that he's out. We know that Joe Burrow's out. We know that this offense is just bad without both of them in the lineup. And so, yes, Bernard is playing a ton of snaps, but he's not getting that many touches. His touchdown upside is not that high. They're not using him that much in the receiving game. And so I know the Cowboys are trash, and this is a great spot, but I really don't trust Giovanni Bernard. again, he's getting touches, he's getting targets, so like he's viable. If you need him as a running back too, go for it. But if you're deciding between two players and you kind of like the player that's not named Giovanni Bernard, go with your gut and don't play him, because I don't see the upside. I know the matchup is great, but this is a horrible offense without Burrow, without Mixon. Like he doesn't have that much upside. Cardinals at Giants is up next, and this game has a 45.5 point total, and the Cardinals are only 2.5 point road favorites. That's a little bit surprising to see, but the Giants have been really good recently. Their defense has been solid, and their offense has been good enough to keep them in games. So for the Cardinals, Chase and Drake yet again split the snaps and the touches. Drake played 45% of the snaps, had 10 carries, 3 targets, and then Edmonds had 55% of the snaps, but then only 6 carries and then 6 targets. The one distinction here is that Drake is pretty clearly preferred at the goal line, whereas Edmonds is preferred in the receiving game. So we look at Drake, he's now 5th among all players in red zone rush attempts on the season. And over the last 2 weeks, he has 13 rush attempts inside the red zone compared to 1 for Edmonds and 0 for Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray has not been running in the red zone recently. So as I've said basically every week, either one of these guys would smash as the lead back. Like if you had just Drake or just Edmonds, they would be an easy running back one every week. But they're splitting the workload evenly. And so Drake, I think, is a low end 2. Again, this week is a little bit thin, so I think you're playing him running back 2 if you have him. And then Edmonds is viable in the flex, but it'll probably come down to what wide receivers you have. I would prefer not to play Chase Edmonds in my running back 2 spot. So then you're looking at flex. Well, you can play wide receivers there, so you don't need to play a running back. So in general, you're probably benching Edmonds this week and playing Drake as running back 2. But understand that Drake kind of needs that touchdown, and he's not going to have that much in the receiving game, so he does have a low floor. But such is the state of running back at this point. For the Giants, Wayne Gallman continues to play really well. He's finished as a top 16 running back in 6 consecutive weeks. And this matchup is also pretty good. You know, he's home. It's a winnable game. I don't know if they're going to win, but there's definitely a chance they do. And if he's winning at home against the Cardinals, no less, like they could run a lot of plays, talking about the Giants. And so if they run a lot of plays and they're winning for a lot of those, I mean, I'm not saying Gallman's going to have 25 touches, but he could. And whenever a running back has been a top 16 running back 6 straight weeks, and now they're going to run a ton of plays in the game they could win, yeah, you're playing Wayne Gallman no matter what. I think he's a running back 1 this week. Broncos at Panthers is up next. This game has a pretty average 46.5 point total, and the Panthers are 3.5 point home favorites coming off their bye as well. For Denver, Melvin Gordon had a really nice game last week, and this is a decent spot against a fairly mediocre Panthers run defense. It still stinks that Lindsey and Gordon are splitting the work, but the worst part isn't even that they're splitting the work, it's that there's no receiving game upside. I mean, this stat is not a joke. They have 2 combined receptions over the last 5 weeks. 2. I mean, that's absurd. You should be using these guys in the receiving game. And you know how many catches Lindsey has in the 2020 season? 2. Phillip Lindsay has 2 receptions this year, and it's not because they're featuring Melvin Gordon. They've combined for 2 over the last 5 weeks. So you're going to need a touchdown for either of these to pay off. You're probably also going to need 60 to 70 rushing yards as well. So while this is a good spot, I just hate how low their floors are. I can only rank Gordon as a flex play, and I do not think you could trust Phillip Lindsay in any format in pretty much any league size, maybe in a 14 or 16 team league, but I'd prefer not to. For the Panthers, we are expecting McCaffrey to be back this week, and if he does return, play him. If not, I actually don't trust Mike Davis anymore. He's been losing workload to other backs. He's been, less efficient when he has been getting the workload he's still getting. So McCaffrey's back, running back 1, obviously. McCaffrey's still out. I don't think you're playing any Panthers running back. Next up, we've got Chiefs at Dolphins. This game has a 49.5 point total, and the Chiefs are touchdown road favorites. For the Chiefs, Bell looked terrible filling in for Clyde last week. He He averaged less than 4 yards a carry. He didn't do much in the receiving game, didn't score, just didn't look all that good. So I would imagine that once Clyde is back from his illness this week, he would probably take over his usual workload, getting around 50 to 60% of the snaps. The Dolphins do have a good overall defense, but they're fairly average to maybe a little bit below average against running backs. But I would just say it's a neutral matchup for the run game. The biggest issue here is not the matchup. The matchup is not a huge problem. It's the split. The Chiefs are just throwing the ball on a massive amount of their plays. And again, like I say every week, that's what they should do. They have Patrick Mahomes at quarterback. Why the heck are you running the ball? Just throw it every play with him. So it makes sense that they're throwing the ball a ton, but for fantasy, that's hurting, the running backs because you're saying, oh, well, if they throw a lot, they'll get a lot of receptions. Well, no, Patrick Mahomes doesn't really check down all that much. So Clyde can have receiving touchdowns, he can have long catches, he can have nice screenplays, but he's not going to get a bunch of checkdowns. It's going to be a situation where Clyde has 10 carries and a few targets. And so you're probably going to need a touchdown for him to pay off. Again, this week's a little thin at running back, so I do think he's running back too just because he's on the Chiefs. He's going to have touchdown upside. And again, if you're confused about last week, he was sick. That's why he wasn't playing, and Bell didn't do anything to separate. So I would imagine Clyde's going to be lead back again. But again, he's got a lower floor than we would like this season being on the Chiefs, but running back too. For the Dolphins, Gaskin played on 71% of the snaps last week, saw 23 touches in his return from the IR. Like we discussed, though, it was really because he was the only healthy back they trusted. Ahmed and Breda were out, and so the backfield was down to Gaskin and Patrick Laird, and we know they're not going to use Laird all that much. So if the same thing happens again this week, then Gaskin will be a very strong running back to play against the Chiefs. The Chiefs are not good at defending opposing running backs. They basically hope that they can get up a bunch of points and force you to throw the ball because they're not good at defending the run. But if one of Ahmed or Breda are back, then the touches are going to take a hit for Gaskin, and I will adjust the rankings accordingly because there's so many different combinations of what could happen. I'm not going to give every single take. But again, if both those dudes are out, you're playing Gaskin. If some or both of them return, or I guess if one or both of them return, just check the rankings, which again are free. Next up, we've got Colts at Raiders. This game has a 51.5 point total, and the Colts are 2.5 point road favorites. For the Colts, Jonathan Taylor's touch counts of 26 and 17 over his last two games with 4 and 3 receptions in each, and that's resulted in 114 and 135 total yards in each game. Now he faces a Raiders defense that ranks dead last in rush defense DVOA and has allowed the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. This is a great spot for Jonathan Taylor, and while he certainly could lose this role, I mean, you can't argue that he's a safe play, but I'm starting him in the league that I have him because he's got the upside, he's got the talent, and it seems like they're shifting workload towards him in an incredible spot. So he would have to fumble. He would have to just perform poorly in the first quarter for them to just use Wilkins and Hines over him. But we've seen that happen before. So don't think that he's just a lock and load play every week moving forward. Great spot. Definitely has a low floor though. As for Hines, a lot more difficult. I would play Taylor over Hines, but that doesn't mean Hines can't have a good game. They're only 2.5 point favorites. So the Colts could absolutely find themselves either down at certain points or even just lose this game outright, and that would benefit Hines. I definitely think Hines is riskier than Taylor because if they get up big, they're not going to be throwing to Hines as much. They're not going to be using him as much either, and so he's got a pretty low floor. If he only has, 3 carries and 3 targets, pretty difficult to produce in that scenario. So if you're playing Hines, you're hoping the Colts get down, which again could happen, but he's game script dependent, and you don't love playing game script dependent running backs because Taylor could still produce if the Colts are losing. For the Raiders, it depends on the health of Josh Jacobs. It does not seem like he'll be available again this week, so assuming he's out, it's probably just going to be a gross committee again. We thought they might just use Booker. That was not the case. They split the touches amongst 3 different running backs. If Josh Jacobs does not play, do not start a Raiders running back. If Jacobs is back, we got to see how healthy he is, and maybe we can start him, but it's also not that great of a spot. Next up, we've got the Jets at the Seahawks. This game has a 46.5 point total, and the Seahawks are 13.5 point home favorites. Although I tweeted something out last week that JM had in the NFL Edge this week, and I thought it was really interesting. The Seahawks have won 19 regular season games since the start of last season. One of them came by 17 points, one of them came by 13 points, and one came by 10 points. The other 16 wins were by 8 points or fewer. So yes, this game could be a blowout, but the Seahawks don't play blowouts. They basically say, hey, we're better than this team. Let's just stay ahead of them by like 10 points until the very end of the game, and we're pretty sure we can beat them in the end. They don't get up big against teams, and so it's worth noting. We see this 13.5 point spread, but 18 of their last 19 wins have come by less than that. So don't think this is an automatic blowout. It's not. On the Jets side, though, unfortunately, we got LaMichael Pirine going on IR on the 24th of November, meaning he will miss another week. We see Gore suffer a concussion last week. He could play. I mean, concussions are pretty different from person to person, so I don't know if he's going to pass that protocol. Pay attention to that. Assuming he's out, the backfield was down to Ty Johnson and Josh Adams, who both played really well, although it was Johnson getting 24 touches to Adams 8. And so I'd have to assume that Johnson will be the lead back if Gore's out. It's probably a moot point, though. The Seahawks have a really good run defense, and the Jets are massive underdogs on the road. And so if you're starting Ty Johnson in the first round of the playoffs, like something went very wrong. And so you should probably prepare for an early exit. For the Seahawks, Carson was up to 58% of the snaps. He gained 110 yards and a touchdown on 16 touches. Hyde dropped to 25% of the snaps, getting 11 yards on 5 touches. It is very clear that Chris Carson is the lead back for the Seattle Seahawks, and he is extremely likely to have a good game against the Jets. And so if you got him, you're starting him as a running back 1. I would not be playing any other Seahawks running back. Next up, we've got Packers at Lions. This game is a massive 55-point total, I believe the highest on the week, and the Packers are 7.5-point road favorites. For the Packers, always start Aaron Jones, especially against a Lions defense that's allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. Jamal Williams is viable since the matchup is so good, but I would probably only go there in a 14-team league. For the Lions, everything depends on DeAndre Swift. It seems likely that he'll return, but I want to hear reports on his expected workload because, if they're going to feature him, he's running back 1. If he's going to be used on a limited basis, well, then he might not even be viable, and now probably everyone isn't viable, even in an incredible spot against a very bad Packers run defense. So we just need to wait until later in the week. Again, check the rankings come Thursday, Friday, Saturday, see how they're changing based on the news we're getting about Swift, because we can't possibly rank any of them until we know that. Next up, we've got Falcons at Chargers. This game has a 49.5 point total, and the Falcons are field goal road favorites. For the Falcons, I still don't trust anyone in that backfield. They're splitting the work, and none of them are playing all that well, so I would continue to bench every single Falcons running back. For the Chargers, despite what you saw last week, Eckler is always a must-start. I know he had a bad game, but he's a great running back. His workload on the ground and through the air is pretty secure. I know Balaj is there, but Eckler's going to get the work. Eckler's going to be good. You are playing him. I would be surprised if he had another bad game this week. The Falcons do have a good run defense, but again, his floor is just so high when they're not losing by 45 that I think you're playing him, and you're not playing any other Chargers running back. Next up, we've got the football team at the 49ers. This game has a 43.5 point total, and the 49ers are 3-point home favorites. For the football team, Antonio Gibson is not expected to play this week with the toe injury, so the backfield will be down to McKissick and Barber. Barber's going to be the early down in the goal line back, while McKissick is almost certainly going to lead the backfield in snaps, and he's going to have a pretty large target share on the offense. He's a very strong running back 2 playing in a full PPR league, and he can be used in the running back 2 spot in a half PPR league. It'll just come down to who you have in half PPR, though, because it's certainly not a lock for him to have, 10 receptions. Like, even in a half PPR league, if he has 10 receptions, it's probably coming for like 60 yards, and that's still, 11 points? So he kind of needs to score, and the scoring upside is still relatively low for McKissick. So in half PPR, you still got to look at the rankings. I'd say full PPR, you probably just lock him into the running back 2 spot because he's going to have a massive target share. As for Barber, I don't know. You have to be pretty desperate to play Barber in a 10 or a 12 team league, but if you need him in a 14 team league, you need him in that second flex spot or something, I guess he could have a touchdown because if they get close, they can use Barber, so maybe you can use him. For the 49ers, it's pretty frustrating what they're doing with these running backs. Mostert is pretty clearly their best running back, but they don't seem to care. They really want to use Jeff Wilson as well. One note is that they lost last week and they were losing for pretty much the whole game, and then McKinnon played 2 snaps. So even in a negative game script where you would think that McKinnon would get snaps, he had 2. And so it's really down to Mostert and Wilson, and it almost seems like they view Wilson as the goal line back. They'll bring in Tevin Coleman only for goal line duties, which is the most infuriating thing. Like if they use Wilson and Mostert between the 20s and they split them and they bring in Coleman for the goal line, you can't start any of them. So I would say Mostert is the only one you can play, and it's probably only in a 14-team league right now, which is annoying because he's a good running back, and this could be a good spot for him. But, I mean, if they're going to do what they're doing with like 3 and 4 different running backs, you just can't play any of them. Saints at Eagles is up next. This game has a 45.5 point total, and the Saints are 7-point road favorites. For the Saints, Kamara finally had a good game with Taysom Hill at quarterback, getting 2 receptions, which was disappointing, but he did gain 88 yards and a touchdown on his 15 carries, which was a sizable lead over Latavius Murray, who only gained 17 yards on 5 carries. The Eagles are a fairly neutral matchup for running backs. Usually, they're a pass funnel with a really good run defense. That's not the case this season. They're a little bit softer against running backs, and so I would say you're starting Kamara again this week if you got him, and then just pray that Breeze is back in weeks 15 and 16. For the Eagles, Jalen Hurts is finally the quarterback. They finally benched Carson Wentz, so hopefully this offense won't be terrible. Unfortunately, this is probably the worst spot you could imagine. The Saints have an elite all-around defense, but they're especially elite against running backs, ranking second in both rush defense DVOA and yards per carry while giving up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. It is tough to imagine a more difficult first opponent for Jalen Hurts, but he's still an improvement over Wentz, so hopefully they can turn things around on offense. I currently have Sanders ranked as a running back 20, and I would prefer to bench him, but as I've said a few times in this video, it's a rough week when you get past that top like 15 to 20 running backs, and so it's very possible you're sitting there like, no, I'm benching Sanders, and then you look at your options and you're like, oh, I actually kind of have to play him at running back 2. I would probably not play him at flex. Like, you've got to have a better wide receiver than Miles Sanders because, like, this is just brutal. It's a really difficult spot. And if they're going to bring in Boston Scott as well, it's pretty unlikely Sanders does well. You know what? If you're a Jalen Hurts fan, you think he's going to produce, you think he's going to improve the offense, I guess it's possible Miles Sanders has a nice game. The Sunday night game will be Steelers at Bills. This game has a 46.5 point total, and the Bills are actually 2.5 point home favorites. For the Steelers, it's pretty gross, honestly. The Steelers offense utilizes 1 million quick passes, and the majority of them don't go to running backs. So there aren't going to be many carries to go around. There aren't going to be many receptions for running backs. And this has been in relatively positive game scripts as well. If the Steelers fall behind in this one, you're going to see even less work for the running backs, and Vegas is projecting the Steelers to play from behind. So it's entirely possible that no running back turns out to be viable. The only one you can play here is James Conner. He's expected to return, but even then, I want to see reports. It's possible that they're limiting his workload his first week back, and if that's the case, no, I'm not playing any Steelers running back if he's getting limited. If he's going to see a full workload, maybe we can play him, but I'll adjust the rankings if that news comes out. For the Bills, Moss was benched after his really bad fumble last week, and so Singletary played 85% of the snaps, and yet he still only finished as running back 25. So in a brutal matchup with the Steelers, I would not be starting either Zach Moss or Devin Singletary. Final game of the week will be Monday Night Football, where the Ravens take on the Browns. The game has a 46.5 point total, and the Ravens are currently 1.5 point road favorites. For the Ravens, I owe it to Dobbins to do a good breakdown on him for getting me into the playoffs on that final touchdown run. But you know what? He deserves it. Like, he's so clearly the best running back on that team, and I do not get why they insist on using Ingram. Like, Gus Edwards has been solid, but why using Ingram? Why is Justice Hill on the field? Like, just use Gus and Dobbins. They're your best two running backs. But anyway, my take on why that was kind of happening last week is that maybe Dobbins wasn't 100% back from COVID. Like, he didn't have it, but his body wasn't 100%. And so maybe they said, okay, we'll activate Justice Hill. We'll use him on third downs, and we'll rotate these other guys on early downs. So if he has another week to recover, maybe he does go back to dominating the touches. Because remember, right before he went on the COVID list, he did dominate the touches. He basically broke out. And then, of course, he gets sick, which was unfortunate. But maybe this coming week that can happen again. And so I think he is a running back too, and that's going to hurt the other running backs on the Ravens. And so I would not be starting any of them. For the Browns, Chubb is an auto start every week moving forward, but Hunt is not anymore. He has touch counts of 14, 10, and 17 over the last 3 weeks, but the targets have kind of gone away. Like, that would be fine if, half of those were receptions, but they're not. And I don't really know why they're not using him in the receiving game anymore, but they aren't. So we have to adjust our take. The Ravens do have an above average run defense. And if Hunt is only going to see like 10 to 12 carries and then 2 to 3 targets, then we can only expect around 10, even 8, maybe 8 to 10 fantasy points without a score. And in a pretty bad week, that might be viable to be like a low end 2, but you're going to be disappointed. I'm just telling you that right now. If Kareem Hunt does not score a touchdown, you're going to be disappointed in his production. He's going to fall in like the late teens to early 20s for rankings because of an average projection. But again, that's kind of up to you. In a 12 or 14 team league, maybe you do have to use him in the flex, but it's also possible that if he's not your running back 2, you have a wide receiver you can use over him in the flex. And if you do, I'd prefer to do that. So that is a breakdown of every backfield in week 14. Remember that the website is free for the rest of the 2020 season, so you can see my exact rankings at all positions over there, as well as a bunch of other information, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, then how about hitting that like button, and how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? Thanks for watching.